The terms left and right originally come from seeding in the early meetings of the French Revolution. The left side, meaning the more radical revolutionaries, wanted to break down the old order. They pushed for equality before the law, the end of feudal privileges, limits on or abolition of the monarchy, and a more democratic system where power came from the people. The right side, meaning royalists and conservatives of the old world order, wanted to preserve tradition and hierarchy. They supported the monarchy, the authority of the church, and the existing social structure, arguing that stability and order depended on maintaining those institutions. In simple terms, the left wanted major change and more equality, while the right wanted continuity, hierarchy, and stability. In the early phase of the French Revolution, the left did not have a single unified economic blueprint, but broadly they wanted to dismantle the old feudal economy and replace it with a more open, merit-based system. That meant abolishing noble privileges, ending feudal dues, removing guild restrictions, and allowing freer trade and property ownership, basically moving toward an early capitalist market economy with legal equality. More radical factions that came later, like the Jacobins, went further, supporting price controls, redistribution, and state intervention, especially in food markets to prevent shortages and inequality. So the left started as pro-free market against feudalism, but parts of it evolved into supporting state-managed fairness when markets produced instability. The early French left was heavily shaped by Enlightenment thought, but not in a simple one-idea way. Think of figures like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Locke, and Montesquieu. From them, the early left took core ideas like political power coming from the people, not divine right, equality before the law, protection of rights like property and liberty, and limits on centralized authority. Economically, this translated into tearing down the feudal system, ending guild monopolies, noble tax exemptions, and rigid class barriers, and replacing them with a more open, competitive economy where individuals could own property and participate freely. But here's the key nuance. Enlightenment thought was not purely free market. Someone like Rousseau was skeptical of inequality and private property concentration. That is why, as the revolution radicalized, parts of the left shifted toward price controls and state intervention when markets caused instability, especially food shortages. So the early left was born out of Enlightenment, ideas of anti-feudalism, equality, and a merit-based society, but it was not strictly laissez-faire capitalism. It had a built-in tension between individual freedom and economic equality that shows up later in left-wing politics. What were France's economic principles before the revolution? Under the Ancien Regime, the economy was heavily controlled and restricted. Trade and production were regulated by guilds, which decided who could enter a profession, how goods were made, and controlled pricing. Internal trade was not fully free either. There were internal tariffs and tolls between regions, meaning goods moving across France could be taxed multiple times. The grain market, arguably the most important sector, was frequently subject to price controls, bans on exports, and government intervention, especially during shortages. On top of that, the tax system was highly uneven and inefficient. Peasants and commoners bore most of the burden through taxes like the tile, while nobles and clergy were often exempt. This distorted incentives and limited economic mobility. There were some moves toward liberalization late in the 18th century, especially influenced by thinkers like François Quesnay and Robert Jacques Turgot, who pushed for freer trade in grain. But these reforms were inconsistent and often reversed due to political backlash. The bottom line is that France's markets were fragmented, regulated, and constrained, very far from what we would call a modern free market economy. The king was considered the ultimate sovereign, and in theory, all land existed under his authority. In practice, land was owned by nobles, the church, and peasants, but the crown could intervene in several ways. It could use eminent domain-style takings, requisitioning land for roads, fortifications, or royal projects, often with compensation, but not always fairly or willingly. Feudal rights and obligations also mattered because peasants did not fully own land in the modern sense. They owed dues and labor, and the system allowed higher authorities to exert control over land use. The crown could also confiscate property for political or religious reasons, especially from those deemed disloyal, such as Protestants after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, or nobles who fell out of favor. Even without outright seizure, heavy taxation and debt pressure could effectively force people to lose land. That said, there were limits. France was not a pure dictatorship, where the king casually grabbed any noble's estate. Powerful elites and legal traditions pushed back, and arbitrary seizures risked rebellion or political crisis. So the king had the authority to take land for national interest, but it was selective, politically constrained, and often dressed up in legal or feudal justification, not a routine free-for-all. In the early years of the French Revolution, from 1789 to 1791, the left was actually pushing a liberal, pro-free market agenda, abolishing feudal dues, ending guild restrictions, and opening up trade. That was much closer to early capitalism than socialism. What changed was the crisis. By the radical phase, around 1792 to 1794, especially under the Jacobins and Maximilien Robespierre, France was dealing with war, food shortages, and internal unrest. In response, they imposed things like price controls on grain through the law of the maximum, requisitioning of goods, and punishments for hoarding and speculation. That looks anti-free market, but it was not socialism in the modern sense. It was emergency wartime control to prevent collapse and starvation, not a coherent plan to abolish private property or create a socialist economy. The shift toward the Jacobin, more radical path happened around 1792 to 1793, not right at the start of the French Revolution. A few key turning points pushed things in that direction. In August 1792, the storming of the Tuileries Palace effectively ended royal power and radicalized politics. In September 1792, the new government, the National Convention, abolished the monarchy entirely and declared the Republic. In January 1793 came the execution of Louis XVI, which became the point of no return because, after killing the king, moderation became much harder. Then in 1793 to 1794 came the rise of the Jacobins under Maximilien Robespierre, bringing the reign of terror, centralized control, and aggressive economic intervention. What drove the shift was not ideology alone, but pressures like war against multiple European powers, internal revolts, food shortages, and economic instability. They did not start as Jacobins. The revolution radicalized step by step, and by 1793, under extreme pressure, the more extreme faction took control and pushed France into the Jacobin phase. What the right wanted economically and socially, and how it connects to later fascism is different but related. Economically, they supported a hierarchical, regulated order based on nobility, church, and corporate bodies where social roles and feudal dues were obligated by tradition. Society was seen as organic and naturally unequal. Stability mattered more than abstract equality or individual autonomy. This rejected classical liberalism, parliamentary democracy, and free markets. Later, nationalism replaced royal dynasties as the source of collective unity, using national solidarity to put order above class conflict. This was not modern socialism's idea of worker ownership to solve class conflict, but a state-directed corporate economy meant to preserve social order. In the book, Neither Right Nor Left, Sternhell describes later fascism's roots as emerging from the crisis of liberalism. In the late 19th century, from the 1870s to the 1890s, the French Third Republic was unstable, and traditional liberalism, free markets, and parliamentary democracy came under attack from both sides. On the left, Marxists criticized capitalism. On the right, nationalists rejected democracy. This created an opening for a new synthesis. In the 1890s to early 1900s, the ideological fusion began with thinkers like Georges Sorel from the left and Maurice Barrès from the right. Sorel rejected parliamentary democracy and embraced myth, violence, and mass mobilization. Barrès emphasized nationalism, rooted identity, and anti-individualism. This is where Sternhell argues the neither left nor right current was born, a rejection of both liberal capitalism and traditional socialism. In the early 20th century, from 1900 to 1914, this anti-liberal synthesis took clearer shape. These ideas converged into a worldview that was anti-liberal, meaning against individualism and free markets; anti-Marxist, meaning it rejected class struggle as the sole driver of politics; and pro-national unity and collective identity. This movement favored strong authority, social cohesion, and mobilized masses over both democracy and laissez-faire capitalism. The World War I era then radicalized everything through crisis. Mass mobilization, nationalism, and state control of the economy became normalized. The idea that society should be unified, disciplined, and directed gained credibility. During the interwar period of the 1920s and 1930s, fascist ideology emerged more fully. Sternhell's core claim is that this neither left nor right synthesis in France prefigured fascism. These movements combined nationalist identity from the right, mass politics, and social mobilization from the left, and rejection of liberal democracy from both. This led directly into the ideological foundations of fascism in Europe. Sternhell's thesis is that fascism was not just a far-right reaction. It emerged from a fusion of radical left anti-capitalism and right-wing nationalism, rejecting liberal democracy entirely. In his view, it was a modern, revolutionary ideology, not just a monarchical, conservative one. Rousseau is still an Enlightenment thinker, but he does not belong to the liberal tradition. He represents a separate branch that splits away from it, where thinkers like John Locke ground society in the rights of the individual. Rousseau shifts the foundation to the collective, arguing that freedom comes from aligning with the general will. That move breaks from liberalism. Once the individual is no longer primary, rights are no longer absolute and can be overridden in the name of the whole. From that point forward, this line of thought develops into modern socialist traditions that diverge further and further from classical liberalism. They may share Enlightenment origins, but they are not liberal, because they reject the core liberal principle that the individual and their rights come first. The French left and right began as two different answers to the collapse of the old feudal corporate order, and both eventually generated collectivist descendants, though in different forms. The early right defended throne, altar, inherited hierarchy, and organic social order. It was not free market. The old regime rested on privilege, corporate bodies, regulated status, and land-based hierarchy, not on atomized individuals competing in a neutral market. Philosophically, it saw society as a historical organism held together by authority, religion, custom, and rank, and it feared that abstract rights, rational redesign, and unrestrained individualism would dissolve the moral fabric of the nation. Rousseau's idea of the general will made sovereignty collective, moral, and potentially coercive, because the common good could be treated as higher than private interest. The Jacobins turned from early market liberalism toward collective politics with price controls, anti-hoarding laws, requisitions, dictatorial powers, moral suspicion of wealth, and the claim that liberty had to be subordinated to the collective. The left starts moving toward collectivist socialism before Marx, not yet as a fully worked doctrine of class ownership, but as the principle that the collective may override property, contract, and market freedom. After the Jacobins, figures like Babeuf push the egalitarian logic further. Britannica explicitly treats him as a forerunner of modern communism, making him a bridge from Jacobin political collectivism to later socialist and communist social collectivism. The right's later path is different, but parallel, preserving the older, anti-liberal core of hostility to atomized individualism, distrust of parliamentarism, contempt for bourgeois materialism, insistence on authority, hierarchy, moral unity, and a society organized as a whole rather than as competing private interests. In neither right nor left, fascism arose from a fusion of the anti-liberal right with a revisionist, anti-materialist, anti-parliamentary left, especially influenced by people like Georges Sorel, whose politics of myth, violence, anti-bourgeois energy, and mass mobilization could migrate from revolutionary syndicalism into fascist forms. Fascism inherits from the right its worship of order, nation, hierarchy, anti-liberalism, and spiritualized politics, and from the left its collectivism, hatred of bourgeois individualism, willingness to mobilize the masses, and belief that the individual must be absorbed into a larger moral whole. That is why fascism could present itself as a third way, against both free market capitalism and Marxist class socialism, organizing the economy through corporatism, state-directed cooperation of classes for the nation. It modernized the old right by replacing loyalty to king and altar with loyalty to the nation, while adopting mass politics and a national collectivism of its own. Fascism is historically connected to the broader collectivist tradition of the left, but in a different form. Socialism universalizes the collective around class or social equality, while fascism nationalizes the collective around nation, authority, and hierarchy. Both break with the original 1789 liberal premise that the individual citizen in a relatively free civil society should stand prior to the state. The Enlightenment splits into Anglo-American and French traditions. The Anglo-American Enlightenment, built on John Locke, emphasized natural rights, life, liberty, and property, government as a limited contract, strong protection of private property, and suspicion of centralized power. The American Revolution was conservative in structure and Lockean in philosophy. It was not trying to reinvent society from scratch. It was a reaction against perceived violations of existing rights, not a total reset. It aimed at preserving what colonists saw as their rights as Englishmen, deeply grounded in Lockean property rights and consent of the governed. The resulting system was the United States Constitution, which limits centralized power, protects property and contracts, creates checks and balances, and avoids mass direct democracy in favor of representation. It was a revolution that tried to freeze and protect individual liberty, not remake human society. In that sense, you can argue it was right-wing in structure, conservative of rights, skeptical of mass power, pro-property, and anti-radical change. From an American Lockean lens, the French royalist traditionalists are anti-individual, anti-market, or at least not market-centered, and collectivist in structure. So if you define left broadly as collectivism over individualism, then the French right would fall under a collectivist umbrella that overlaps with what Americans think of as left wing. The American Revolution redefines left and right around individualism versus collectivism, not historical European labels. The American Revolution is best understood as a Lockean, rights-preserving individualist revolution, what modern Americans would often call right-wing. When I say the American Revolution was conservative in structure, I mean it was a revolution that changed political authority without trying to radically remake society itself. Unlike the French Revolution, the American colonists were not trying to tear down religion, abolish social hierarchies, or redesign human nature and society from abstract theory. They believed they were defending existing rights, not inventing new ones, rights rooted in John Locke and in what they saw as traditional English liberties. So, conservative in structure means preservation over reinvention. They kept most existing institutions, property rights, local governance, and common law traditions, rather than wiping the slate clean. The main goal was to replace British rule with self-rule, not to socially equalize everyone or destroy class distinctions. The Constitution limited government, divided power, and slowed decision-making through federalism, separation of powers, checks and balances, and legal constraints like the Bill of Rights. This was basically the opposite of revolutionary centralization. It was an individual-first philosophy. Government exists to protect individual rights, not to enforce a collective vision of society, which is what makes it fundamentally different from the French Revolution. Modern conservatism and classical liberalism overlap a lot, but they come from different starting points and priorities, even if they often land on similar policies. Classical liberalism is a theory-first ideology that starts with abstract principles and designs society around them. Modern conservatism is more tradition-first and stability-focused. It sees society as more than just individuals. It includes institutions, culture, religion, inherited norms, and national identity. Change should be gradual and cautious. Markets are generally supported, but not as an absolute, because order and social cohesion can override pure market logic. Classical liberalism builds society to maximize individual freedom. Modern conservatism preserves and protects the social order that allows freedom to exist. They often align on free markets, limited government, and property rights, which is why American conservatism often looks like classical liberalism. It inherited a system already built on those ideas from the American Revolution. Modern conservatism, especially in the American tradition, can be understood as an attempt to take the Lockean framework seriously in the real world rather than leaving it as pure theory. Starting from Locke's core claims, classical liberalism says to minimize power and let individuals operate freely. The problem is that, in practice, a society made only of isolated individuals and minimal authority can become unstable through foreign threats, crime, disorder, or institutional erosion. Modern conservatism steps into that gap and says, you do not preserve individual liberty by weakening the state to nothing. You preserve it by building a state strong enough to defend liberty, but limited enough not to crush it. That is why the system that comes out of the American Revolution and gets formalized in the United States Constitution looks the way it does. It is not anarchic, and it is not hyper-centralized. It is structured restraint. Power exists, but it is divided through federalism and separation of powers, checked through checks and balances, and legally constrained through the Bill of Rights. This allows government to function and act decisively when necessary, while making it very hard for it to become tyrannical. In other words, modern conservatism accepts that order is a prerequisite for liberty, not its enemy. Economically, modern conservatism keeps the classical liberal commitment to private property and markets, but treats them as part of a broader system that must be protected and stabilized. Property rights require courts, enforcement, and national defense. Markets require trust, contract law, and sometimes guardrails. So while a pure classical liberal might say, the less government, the better, a conservative says, the right kind of government is necessary for markets to even exist. That includes maintaining infrastructure, enforcing contracts, and preventing collapse or chaos that would destroy economic freedom altogether. Where modern conservatism really diverges from pure classical liberalism is in its recognition that people are not just individuals. They are members of a nation, a culture, and a historical community. That means protecting national cohesion and identity through borders, shared norms, civic identity, and institutional continuity. The argument is that if you lose those, the abstract rights Locke talks about do not survive long in practice. A completely atomized, rootless society becomes easy to destabilize, fragment, or dominate. Classical liberalism says, maximize freedom and minimize power. Modern conservatism says, build a durable system that can actually protect that freedom over time, even if that requires some level of organized authority. It is not abandoning Lockean principles. It is engineering a society that can survive while holding on to them.